people admire China. People are curious. People want to know about how China did this. Because we remember, even if a lot of young Chinese people don't, what China was like 60 years ago, what China was like 100 years ago. But we have seen the transition. And we've seen that transition take place in a period where we have stagnated or even fallen behind. China's been moving up. Okay. So when you say to people that China is a socialist or communist country, it makes them sit up. Maybe this communism thing is not so bad. It helps create a conversation. We are just beginning to learn the details of the process as it's obtained in China and learning what variables there are that could be used in Africa. How does this work in our part of the world?
At the end of the day, what matters is the material conditions of people. The living conditions matter. How can you come and tell the Chinese people that their system is bad today? The system that has lifted them out of poverty over a historical shortest period possible. How can you tell them to hate themselves, to hate the effort, the products of their own efforts? For a long time, as Comrade Opoku has said, they were trying to attribute the Chinese success to capitalism. But the Chinese leaders and the Chinese people are saying we have developed because of socialism. That's what President Xi Jinping is telling the world, is telling us. That's what we are learning from them.
Since its inception in 2006, the Brics cooperation mechanism has steadily developed into a stable platform for dialogue and cooperation between its members: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
In your opinion, how important is Brics? What kind of difference it can bring to the global South?
Yeah, Brics right now, it's maybe one of the most important initiatives we have politically in the whole world and economically. So as you said, I mean, that right now there's the meetings happening. Brics today it's 5 countries. China, I mean, if you take from GDP, PPP, which is the real GDP, the purchase parity power. So China is the biggest economy in the world. India is the 3rd. Russia is the 6th. And Brazil is the 8th. So of 8 economies, the 4 out of 8 are in Brics.
President Xi Jinping has called on the G20 to work together to meet the challenges of our times and build a better future. He said the summit comes at a time of momentous change. He said all countries should advocate peace, development, and win-win cooperation.
As the APEC 2022 chair, Thailand will hold the APEC CEO Summit ahead of the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting. As the first in-person CEO summit in 3 years since the start of the pandemic, the gathering aims to discuss solutions to the world's current and future challenges.
Why do you think alliances like APEC, ASEAN, and all these Southeast Asian countries coming together is so important?
These are countries that have ties and relations and trade that stretch back generations and generations, centuries and centuries. So it seems like a very natural progression socioeconomically and politically. All of these groups of people continuing to work together, trade, travel to one another's nations, increasing understanding among each other. And again, I have watched this region go from a place that was heavily under Western influence, the waning Western imperialism that had been fading away from this region, and it being replaced by actual genuine cooperation, as the Chinese government always says, win-win cooperation. I've watched it happen. I've watched one system fade and one replace it, and you can see the difference. This is a stark contrast.
Xi Jinping arrived in Riyadh Wednesday for the first Arab-China summit. for cooperation and development. He's set to leave tomorrow after meeting with leaders from the Gulf states, including Iraq and Qatar.
Can you share with us your thoughts on the importance of this cooperation between China and the Arab world, and especially what kind of importance, what kind of influence it will bring to the world economy, especially now we are all witnessing unprecedented changes in the world?
The Arab world, as we people should know, is that it stretches from West Asia, like Iraq, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and the Gulf countries. But then it crosses over to Africa, to Egypt, North Africa, Sudan, and we have also other countries like the Comoros in the Indian Ocean. This region is very, very important if you look at its location, geographical location. It's at the crossroads between three continents. It's also between Asia, Europe, and Africa. We have the connection between the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean. So this is one of the most important knots in the global trade and connectivity network, which the Belt and Road Initiative is rebuilding with modern means. The Arab countries are home to almost more than 2/3 of the oil and gas reserves in the world. It has a massive financial reserve, but also a very, very young population with great aspirations and demands for development. So it's a perfect match to have China, which has developed in such a fast fashion to a modern, prosperous nation, and the Arab nations who have similar aspirations, that the two can match each other and work together. And the visit by President Xi Jinping is going to be a massive event in the history of this region, because this is happening, as you said, in a time of massive change in the world, where the world economic pivot is moving to the east with China, East Asia, ASEAN countries, and we have the old geopolitical system is really not functioning. It's threatening with wars, regional wars, but probably, as in the case of Ukraine, we could have a world war emerging out of that. So therefore, there is a very clear indication for these Arab countries where the future lies, and that is in the east. But also, the Arab nations can become a bridge between east and west, so we don't have a divided world once more, but that the world should unite between east and west in the Arab world around principles of economic cooperation and win-win, as President Xi Jinping phrases it, to build a future community for the future of the humankind.
Hello everyone, welcome to Talk It Out with me, Li Jingjing. This show aims to show you the voices and stories from China and the rest of the Global South. The economic, cultural, and security cooperation between China and other developing nations has been increasing over the years. And the exchanges between China and the African continent could be dated back to the 14th century. Now China is Africa's #1 trading partner. The engagement between China and South America also grew significantly in the past decades. 151 countries have joined the infrastructure development strategy, the Belt and Road Initiative, which was launched in 2013. And this year marked the 10-year anniversary of the launch. So quite a number of participants are nations from the Global South. And of course, this engagement got some nations wary. Strategists and experts are trying to figure out the reasons behind the closeness between these nations and China. Some even used smear campaigns trying to drive a wedge between these nations and China. So why do Africa and Latin America choose to work with China? In this episode, I invited two guests from Africa and Latin America to help us understand the views of this region. Before I bring the two distinguished guests to this show, let me remind everyone who is watching this live stream now, please leave your questions, leave your comments in the live chat, keep the live chat going, and also hit the like button, so that will help this live stream be promoted by the algorithm of YouTube, send us further by the algorithm. Voices like ours are often being neglected by the mainstream media. So your comments, your questions, your interactions with this live stream really help us. And also, I've been watching the live chat now. I have a laptop, it's showing the live stream with me. So do let me know what you think. I will read your comments and try to answer the questions you gave me. So now let's bring our guests to the show. So our guest today, my first guest is Kyeretwie Opoku, convener of the Socialist Movement of Ghana. He was on my show before discussing the relations between China and Africa, and that video is very popular, got thousands of views on my channel. So go check it out on my channel. And Opoku, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
And my second guest today is also an old friend of this show, Marco Fernandes, researcher with Troy Continental Institute for Social Research. He's on my show many times, always enlightening us with a perspective from Brazil. So Marco, welcome back to the show. Marco? You muted yourself.
Oh, sorry.
I will give you one more chance to say hello to our audiences. So Marco, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. Great to be here again, especially with this great comrade Opoku. Let's have a great chat together.
Okay.
Yeah. So as I mentioned a little bit in the intro. So every country, every nations in the world are pursuing independence and development, providing better life for their people. But we know the journey for many nations is not easy, particularly for African nations and Latin American nations. So first, can you share with us the struggles that people in this region face? So how about we start with you, Opoku? So what are the struggles that countries in Africa face when pursuing independence and development?
Okay, thank you very much. As I said, it's a great pleasure to be back here. Independence, the struggle for independence, the struggle for development is always a continuum. So you're absolutely right that it happens over a period of time. It's not just an event. Africa as a whole is still very much engaged in its struggle for independence, for unity, and for development. It is true that many of our countries became legally independent from 1907 through, say, about 1975. That was really legal independence, in that the former colonial powers withdrew from direct governance of our countries. But the fact is that they left behind many, many structures of power, many, many structures of social organization. So once you've got political independence, legal independence, you now have the process of reorganizing your society around your own interests such that you become truly independent and such that you can pursue development for yourselves. An example is our legal systems. Almost every African country has a legal system that originated in colonial rule, i.e. British law, French law, Portuguese law, etc. Now, what that means is that, for example, we're all natural resource producers, most African countries. But the regimes under which our natural resources are developed are regimes that were developed in Europe, which prioritize the rights of private agents over the rights of the society as a whole. So you have a situation in which, in almost every case, whether it's gold, whether it's iron, whether it's manganese, whether it's a lot of the more modern strategic minerals, the regime for developing those is a regime that gives priority to the rights of the private investor, who almost always is from the West. So you're talking about continued domination of our most fundamental economic production by Western companies, European, American, Japanese, etc. And as long as the mindset remains that the rights of those companies take precedence over the rights of our citizens, you will always have a situation in which, no matter how much of the mineral you produce, the benefits of that production are going outside of your country, directly into the pockets of Western capitalism. You have the same kind of situation if you look at our educational systems. And I think I'm dealing with the soft parts because that's really what remains in place. We have educational systems that were fundamentally designed by Europe to meet the needs of the European capitalist class and then transposed onto us. We're educated in languages that are not our own. We are taught with values that are not our own. We are never taught our own culture, except as a sort of curiosity. It's not part of our socialization. Okay. So you have in the leadership class of our societies, you have in the civil service, in the military service, certainly in the political class, many, many Africans who have been trained to think like Europeans. I'm not talking about logical processes, but just in terms of what you prioritize, what you see as good for society. A lot of our leaders think in terms of profitability of an enterprise as being good for society as a whole, regardless of what the actual outcomes are for the communities that suffer these investments. You have financing systems. An egregious example is in Francophone Africa. For many, many years, all the French-speaking former colonies had their currencies tied to the French franc. Subsequently became the euro. But what that meant was that monetary policy was not set in any of our countries. It was set and managed from France. Additionally, you had a situation in which all these countries kept their reserves in the French Central Bank. So for purposes of development spending, development planning, these countries had to go to France to borrow from their own reserves and pay interest to France for using their own reserves. These are the kinds of things that limit your capacity to develop. We still have finance systems that are entirely based on Western financial standards. Lending is not a process of developing enterprise, developing individuals, enabling the state to do more. It's the process oriented around extraction of profit by the banks from our societies. We've kept that model for 60 years, even though it's very obvious that it doesn't benefit our society in any way. Okay? So these are the kinds of challenges. They relate to the cultural and social baggage that colonialism left behind. Another good example, I think, is just the media. All of us are conditioned in Africa. It's very, very deeply conditioned. For example, to consider a European accent, a British accent, for example, is seen as authoritative. A lot of us don't even realize that we have this prejudice, but we do associate a British accent with the truth. We tend to prefer, we get our information about the rest of the world, geopolitics, trade, etc., through the media of the BBC, of Deutsche Welle, all those foreign stations. And you actually have a situation in which even local radio and TV presenters develop something that in Ghana we call LAFA, locally acquired foreign accents. The idea being that to sound authoritative, you had to sound like a BBC presenter or like a Voice of America presenter. So you actually had our media men aping the accents and so on of foreign presenters in order to sound authoritative, in order to get the message across. Now, of course, that relates also to our very low news gathering capacity. So you find that all the news we have about the outside world comes to us through BBC, through VOA, through Deutsche Welle, and so on. And I'm talking literally word for word. The foreign news segment will be lifted from a BBC report and presented to us, okay? Even by our own radio stations. So you still have that very, very powerful cultural influence that the West has over our society. And it's something that we continue to struggle against. Because, as you pointed out, if you cannot be independent, you cannot develop, you cannot think your own thoughts, you cannot dream your own dreams and plan your own development. So that's the problem that Africa as a whole is struggling with. There are some encouraging signs. For example, recently, in the last month or so, 3 countries in West Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea, that's Guinea-Conakry, announced that they are working on a unification of their nations. So they will achieve a federation of states. They haven't given a timeline. It's an ambitious program, and there will be a lot of resistance from the Western world, from ECOWAS heads of states and so on, who have a lot to fear from the unification of these countries. But it is a sign, at least, that there's a generation of leaders now who are thinking of the solution of our problems in terms of greater unity. We had that before, back in the late 50s and 60s, when you had leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Modibo Keita, and so on, and even the comrade from Congo. They thought in terms of unification and built, unions of states that were meant to allow us to use our resources together, to think through our diplomatic operations, to think through our security operations, and think through development together. There are signs that this is back on the table and that there's a bright future to look forward to.
Okay, and you know what, just as you are talking, Opoku, there's someone in the comment section said, my friend from Barbados once told me they still have a treaty with Britain to send free sugar to them for over 60 years of independence. So the same story is taking place all across the world. And as you just mentioned, the struggles that African nations are facing, even though the colonizers left, but they didn't really left. And I think even China, we saw that as well. The Hong Kong once was being colonized by the British, but you saw the legacy that left. So, but now that's Africa. What about Latin America, Marco? So what are the struggles that people in Latin America face? I think probably we will hear similar stories, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, first of all, I would say Latin America, the 3 biggest problems we have is first, imperialism, second, imperialism, and third, imperialism, which is basically the same history in Africa and in Asia and almost everywhere in the world. And I would say of course, we have different histories in terms of how Western powers organize both colonialism and imperialism in Latin America and Africa. But at the end of the day, we've just been submitted to this in the last 500, 600 years. And after all, as we know, this is based on the Western model of modernization, which, by the way, China is now also elaborating a very important deep criticism of this model, as we could see in the last 20th National Congress, which is basically a model of modernization based on plundering, slavery, exploitation, this destruction of the nature. And this is the challenges that all of our societies in the Global South, that today is called Global South, before it was colonies, then Third World, etc. But this is basically the same system. And I would say in case of Latin America, we also have this complexity, which is not only, of course, the main drivers are external forces from Western powers, but we also have an issue with the local elites of our countries in Latin America. Because, well, first of all, these elites, they are mostly white. They are mostly descendant of Europeans in Brazil, in Mexico, in Colombia. And they are also economically, ideologically, even existentially, they are subservient to Europe and to United States. I mean, if you see, this is almost a joke for us, but it's true. I mean, they prefer to live in Miami than to live in São Paulo, in Mexico City, or in Bogota. They are heavily attached, even like emotionally, I would say, with this feeling that, okay, United States, it's a better country, it's a better society. And of course, for them, because they have been also profiting first of colonialism and then even imperialism, because we know that US needs also its local allies to be able to succeed in its many kinds of interventions that they have been organizing, especially in the last century. So this elite, they are not committed with the people. They don't have identification with the people. And you know, it's also a racial thing, because, I mean, think about Brazil, for instance. I mean, most of the elite is basically white. Most of the population are non-white. They are descendant of indigenous people, of Black people that were brought from Africa, kidnapped and forced to work for hundreds of years to build all the wealth in the continent that was, of course, exported to Europe. So these elite, they don't have identification. They're not committed to a national project that is really addressing the needs of the people. So we have, you know, that we have like a famous sentence in Mexico, but this is for the whole Latin America. We say like, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the US. And this is actually what these white elite, they feel. They feel they're so close to US and so far from, not from God, but from its own population. And I would say that it's also important to understand how much there was different kinds of interventions. And now I'm going to not speak about colonial times because it's 500 years. We're not going to have time here. But just to speak about even the last century, what was the role of the United States in the region, in the so-called their backyard, they also changed the kind of intervention. It got more sophisticated. I mean, in the 19th century, countries of Latin America, almost all the countries were, I mean, they were independent already officially. But even though, like, for instance, United States, they invaded Mexico and they took like almost half of Mexico's territory in the 19th century. So that was the more direct, more aggressive kind of intervention that US realized in the continent. But then you have, for instance, in the 60s and the 70s, not like a direct intervention, but a sort of like a coalition with local elites and support of coup d'etats in our country. So you can have, for instance, the example of Brazil, 1964, when they organized the coup, and the president at that point, a very progressive president, João Goulart, had just organized, it was just proposing an agrarian reform that would share the land more equally in the country among the peasants.
well, that was the red line for the bourgeoisie, the local elite, and US. So they organized a coup d'état. The same happened, for instance, in Chile in 1973. Allende was also elected president, very progressive, very popular, was about to nationalize copper, which is still today is the main natural resource of Chile. Well, that meant a couple of phone calls from Henry Kissinger from Washington to the military in Chile, and the coup was organized. Then in the 80s and the 90s, they did something that they did also in Africa, was working with IMF, using IMF. That was the times in the 80s of the external debt crisis in the whole third world. So countries didn't have more international reserve. They didn't have dollar. They needed to ask IMF loans to IMF to be able to do trade, which is a big problem still today. So IMF came with this their austerity measures and the whole list of measures. The country had to cut the budgets. They had to privatize it on their national resources. They had to cut the social budget. So that was the way also to submit our countries in the 80s and the 90s. And then you get to the 2000s, when they have this new form, like this, what we call now the hybrid wars, which is a more sophisticated way to change regimes or to choke economy of the country, like they did, for instance, with Cuba since the 60s, is true, but with Venezuela in the 2000s, right in the moment where you had the President Chavez, who was trying to build a national project and get the resources from the oil. That is, Venezuela is one of the biggest producers of oil in the world, to try to put this money into people's needs, in education, in health, and many other needs. So that was also a sign for US to say, no, this cannot go on. And of course, Venezuela was also challenging imperial domination of US in the continent. So, and the same with Dilma and Lula, the coup organized in Brazil. This is already documented how much the Department of Justice and the FBI, they were also very important to the judge Moro, for instance, who put Lula in jail with accusations that are now proved to be false, or even before. That was 2018, but even before, when President Dilma was overthrown by the Congress, with accusations that also today the same Congress admits that they were not actually true. So this has been the history of Latin America, on and on and on. And so, I mean, and I don't think this will stop unless, of course, our countries are able to be more organized together in the regional platforms and also with global platforms. But I think we can talk more about this in the next questions.
Mm-hmm. And I remember, like you in the previous interview, you said whenever there's a Latin American country start to grow, there's a coup.
Exactly.
Happens.
Oh, and you know who said that was President Lula. President Lula said that in an interview to Guancha in 2021. Exactly. And there's a coup, and he said, and you're looking for it, and there's always the U.S. ambassador in the middle of the coup. So that's unfortunate, it's our history, but we had to change it.
And you know, because China eradicated absolute poverty by 2020 and lifted 800 million people out of poverty. And I noticed from different social networks, from the news, that I noticed there's a growing interest in the global South in understanding and learning about China's experience of eradicating poverty and developing their own economy. So I'm just wondering, is that true? Is that true? There's a growing interest in Africa and Latin America that people want to know how China eradicated poverty, and if so, why? So how about we start with you, Opoku?
Well, there's a massive interest. There's a truly massive interest in what China has done and how China did it and how China sustains it. Because obviously, I mean, like Marco said, our biggest problem is imperialism. But imperialism expresses itself most directly in the poverty of our people. 800 million is, 3/4 of Africa, the entire African continent. And we probably have about that many people in serious poverty here. So for anybody who's interested in the progress of the South, who's interested in the progress of Africa, the fact that somebody else, in this case China, has achieved your biggest objective target has to be of interest. You have to ask the questions. How do they do it? Can it be repeated? Can it be replicated for us and so on? Now, of course, we already feel in Africa a great affinity for China. We've had long relations. You mentioned yourself just how far back trading and exploration has existed between our peoples. But particularly after World War II, China was very present in Africa's efforts towards independence, Africa's efforts towards a restart, a reconstruction of our ways of living. And we learned quite a bit about the Chinese Revolution, about the struggles of China in the 19th century, your own experiences. You were never quite colonized, but you had a rough time with Japan, you had a rough time with the Americans, with the British, everybody and so on. And so there's a certain affinity there that's important for us. Now, we look at where China is today, and we look through our relationship over the last 50 years. And it's clear to us that China has been systematically on its way up, whereas we have stagnated. We know that the models that our old imperial masters have tried to feed us in terms of following all sorts of financing schemes, in terms of following all sorts of agricultural fads and so on, in terms of handing over your entire economy to private business interests. We know that that has failed. It has failed several times over and it's dead. It's dead neocolonialism in Africa has failed completely. And that's probably part of the reason why the West is remilitarizing and getting ready to colonize us again properly, because they know that they can't hold the fort with just neocolonialism. But then here comes China. Mm-hmm. China doesn't have colonies. China was not a huge slave dealer for 400 years. China has one of the largest single population in the world. And China has lifted that population from poverty. In the 70s, for example, Ghana had a higher GDP per capita than China did. That's in my lifetime. But China today is, depends on what, metrics you use. China is either the second largest or the largest economy in the world. China has become the center of manufacturing. China has become the center of world trade. China has become the center of science and technology. So, and it did this without colonies, without exploitation of other countries. There's clearly something there. And we need to understand how that is done. Because obviously, Africa cannot find anybody to colonize. Africa cannot find anybody to enslave, to extract resources from, nobody to exploit and lift a handful of people up. So we see the lessons. We hear it is central planning, creative, central, granular planning, done not just sitting by people in Beijing, but out in the countryside, out in the cities. We see a party structure that is actively engaged with the people, helping people solve problems, putting that together into a national plan. We see a state investing in the infrastructure that backs that kind of project. We see a state directly engaged in addressing the nationalities question. Any society on earth has a nationalities question. Africa, if we manage to unify, as I think we will, we will have a huge nationalities question. A nationalities question complicated by overlays of, imperial imperial languages and culture and all of that. But we see a country that has developed a meritocracy. We see a country that has developed a peaceful path, not bullying its neighbors, not imposing sanctions left, right, and center on anybody who disagrees with it, not at war with anybody. We see that, and we want to understand how it works. Even the right-wing elements in African society, and there are a lot of them. Africa is still very much dominated by imperialism. Even those elements recognize that something unique, something historic, something epoch-making has happened in China, and that if we do not come to terms with it, we will not be part of the future. As for the poverty alleviation, I mean, it's difficult to talk about that except in superlatives, And I think CGTN is doing a lot of good work in propagating just the stories of the poverty eradication program. I've watched the Kuhn movie. I read stuff put out, watched stuff put out by Tings and so on. And it's really just phenomenal. You're talking about, what, 3 million young party cadre going out over years to do the research, to understand what is happening in the remotest parts of the country, up in the mountains and so on. You're talking about, what, another 5 million going to live there and actually develop programs all the way down to individual households. Every household has a plan. Every single household has a plan for getting out of poverty. And there's an individual who's working with them, who's monitoring, at least monthly. That's something that has never happened in world history. It has never happened in world history. And it's definitely something that the world needs to learn from China. Because, maybe there's some other miraculous route out there, but we haven't seen it. China has done it. China has documented it. China has a model that we can replicate sensibly, not trying to repeat every single thing that China did. You have to adapt for your society, for your culture, for your history. But it can be done. Yeah.
So thank you, Opoku. And I also want to hear Marco. So I'm wondering, is that the same interest growing in Latin America? And do you think that China's experience of eradicating absolute poverty can be adapted to Latin America?
Yes, of
You're
course.
muted again.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm back. No, I mean, absolutely. I think Opoku already gave a very comprehensive answer, and I don't think this is not an African point of view. I think this is a global South point of view. So just a couple of things I would like to add. 100% agree with every word that Opoku said, and I would say also one of the things that and this I think it's angering a lot the Western powers, is that China is actually showing to the whole global South that there is an alternative to the Washington consensus. There is an alternative to neoliberalism. That the key decisions about politics, economy, and the resources of our countries should not be taken by people in Washington or in London or in Paris or in Brussels, but should be taken in Beijing, in Accra, in Brasilia, in Johannesburg, in Mexico City, in our countries. And I would say that, I mean, for the whole period, as I was explaining, from the whole period of especially the 80s and the 90s, when you have the full implementation of neoliberalism in both Africa and Latin America, they were able to form a kind of a consensus in our societies that even like people, like ordinary people doesn't know more about so much about politics, they will tell you, oh, the state is bad. The state is corrupt. Oh, we should not have state-owned companies because they're not efficient, because actually they're a source of corruption. The politicians are just making money, and they don't care about the needs of the population. And this become a common sense to people who were directly affected by, for instance, the privatization of energy companies that increased a lot the prices of the energy for the whole people, or for people who were affected by the lack of good education, because the state couldn't afford a good public schools to its population, or people were affected by the cut of budget of social pensions. So the elders didn't have enough money to eat. Even those people, at some point in the 90s, especially in Latin America, they would badmouth the state. They would say, yeah, let's sell all our national companies. Let's privatize the copper. Let's privatize the oil. And they were actually very successful in many countries in Latin America. I would say almost all of the countries in Latin America. I think Brazil at some point at the beginning of the 2000s, and this has to do with the election of President Lula for the first time in 2002, and some other countries also, the experience was so terrible. Neoliberalism destroyed so much our social networks, the social fabric, the life of the people, that people started to realize, okay, neoliberalism is actually not in our interest. This is about the interest of the finance capital, of US multinational companies, European multinational companies. So at the end of the day, what China was doing at the same time, and of course, it took a few years. It took actually 2-3 decades for us to see the result. But China was going to a very different path. And at this time, when Opoku was saying, I mean, China today is the largest economy in the world in GDP, in the PPP terms, in the relative terms, depending of the purchase power. So China is showing that, okay, guys, we worked hard for 30, 40 years doing exactly the opposite of what Washington told you guys to do. And they actually also tried to tell China to do, but China said, no, sorry. We are a different country. We are a socialist country, and we are going to a different path. So I think that's also what explains how much the Western powers are so scared with China right now. And finally, I would say, as a Brazilian, even with huge cultural difference that we have between Latin America and China, when I look to China, when I look around and see what China was able to accomplish, and in the deep of my soul, I feel, okay, they're actually one of us. They made it. We are people of color. We are people from the global south. They made it. Maybe we also can do it. So I think this is the biggest lesson. And of course we know, and we can discuss more, there's a huge difference in terms of governance, in terms of how politics is made. But I think this feeling, and China, I think right now it's sort of emulating this feeling in its discourse to the global south, is that, guys, we can do it together. We don't need them, because they are not interested in our well-being. They're just interested in their profits. So that's why I think the next decades, they're going to be a very challenging moment for the whole global south, because this increasing attacks from the empire. But I think there are also lots of windows of opportunities are being opened for us in the global south.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned how China's success could be an inspiration for the global south. You know, I've been reading several reports from different media, Western mainstream media. Of course, they tend to use debt trap to describe China's investments in Africa, in Latin America. Or they will say this engagement between China and Latin America and Africa is just China's strategic goal. So the way they write the article is like, it's just a rhetoric that China uses. It's not a sincere cooperation. But like, I want to read a few quotes from the work report, the report to the 20th Party Congress. So there's one chapter, it just says China's goal of promoting world peace. And I can read a few lines and you decide whether you believe it and what do you think about it. For example, it's very clear that China says China has always been committed to its foreign policy goals of upholding world peace and promoting common development. And it is dedicated to promoting a human community with a shared future. And China also promised that no matter what stage of development it reaches, China will never seek hegemony or engage in expansionism. Now, also, China endeavors to strengthen solidarity and cooperation with other developing nations and safeguard the common interests of the developing world. And I think this is very important. Wondering what's your guys' thoughts on this? China is prepared to invest more resources in global development and cooperation. It is committed to narrowing the North-South gap and supporting and assisting other developing countries in accelerating development. So I'm wondering, what's your guys' opinion on this? Do you think this is sincere? And can this really help people in Africa and people in Latin America? Opoku, how about we start with you?
Yeah, I absolutely think it's sincere. I mean, China has walked the talk with Africa right from the beginning, back to at least the post-war area. As I'm saying, it is not simply modern day China, huge, powerful country and so on. But even when China had nothing, they shared that nothing with us. China always collaborated with us. China always sought to work with us to achieve global goals like peace, to avoid conflict, to uplift everybody. China was at Bandung. Okay? It's not anything new. These are positions China has held at least since Mao. This is the bedrock of Chinese communism and China's outlook on the world. In more recent times too, we've seen it. You mentioned when we started, you mentioned the Belt and Road Project. I think there are 41 African countries involved in that initiative. They are seeing concrete benefits. The US can say whatever it likes, but if you go to visit any African country today and look at the infrastructural development that is taking place, it is almost and inevitably being driven by Chinese corporation. We're not talking about lending, and there's nothing wrong with lending money in solidarity. There's nothing wrong with international cooperation. That's not a problem. It is when the terms of that cooperation are structured such that what is actually taking place is an extraction of resources. What is actually taking place is a disempowerment of, say, African countries. That is problematic. That is not what we have seen with China in case after case. Yes, there are some problems with individual Chinese capitalists who may be operating in Africa in ways that are not desirable. That exists. China is still on its own path towards communism. And at this moment, capitalism itself is still a powerful force in China. So you will have private elements that do not live up to the high ideals that that the party and the state have set for the conduct of its relations with the South. But that does not contradict the validity, the sincerity of the commitments that we all had from the 20th Congress, and that we've already seen in practice. Before the Congress, we were seeing the action in these terms. And that's part of the reason, as I said earlier, that there's so much interest in what China is doing and how China is doing it. So yes, there's tremendous Western propaganda. It's increasing. Now China is almost responsible for the war in Ukraine. That's the biggest thing now, that China is about to give Russia weapons and so on. They are not talking about the real concrete demonstrations. For example, China has proposed tariffs for a peace program. The West is ignoring that and talking about weapons. People see through these things. You do not have to be a very sophisticated political player to see what the great powers are doing. Okay. I'm absolutely confident that the majority of Africans, not I almost said Ghanaians, consider the Chinese program as announced at the 20th Congress as sincere, as a genuine opportunity for collaboration, for win-win development for both our societies. This is something we desperately need for the whole world. And it's something that we will reach out to achieve from Africa as well. Yeah, let me stop there for now.
Okay, Marco, so as a Brazilian, as a Latin American yourself, when you hear China's commitment of narrowing the North and South gap and committed to promoting world peace, what's your thought on this? Do you believe this commitment is sincere? And what does it mean for people in the Global South or in Latin America, for your case?
I think first thing is try to understand more of the depth of Chinese culture. In the Chinese culture, especially because of Confucianism, there is a tradition of you don't say something if you don't act like. So one of the things that for us in Latin America and Africa, in so-called like in between Global South and Western political culture, we are so used to see politicians lying all the time in campaigns, electoral campaigns. I'll do this, I'll do that, and this is actually a lot of like the accusations that China has been suffering in the last years, especially from the US, is based on this projection, because this is what they do all the time. They lie all the time. They promise things all the time, and they don't fulfill it. Like just one example. Do you remember, guys, like less than 2 years ago, there was a G7, I think it was in UK. And at the end of the meeting, they said, oh, guys, now we have an alternative to a BRI. Because, BRI is actually just a trap that China is trying to set to the Global South countries. And then they promise like that amazing, very nice name called Build Back Better World. You guys remember that? They pledged $30 trillion of investment until 2035. This was almost 2 years ago. Do you read any news about this lately? Nothing. Because they actually forgot about it. They actually already created another proposal. I even forgot the name because it just lasts 1 week in the media. But this is what they do. And this is almost like the opposite of what China or what political culture in China does. I mean, they're not gonna, if they don't mean it, they're not gonna promise. So, okay, even like the debt trap. I mean, we know this. Even guys can watch many shows of Ding Ding in this channel. How many people bringing data debunking the so-called debt trap myth that we know most of the debt in Africa actually belongs, 2/3 belongs to the Western countries. And the majority of this is actually in private banks in New York, London, and Frankfurt. So come on, this is one thing. But now going back to, okay, is there any signs that China is accomplishing its proposals? Well, already Opoku already mentioned, of course, BRI. I mean, we had 21 countries in Latin America part of BRI. But there's one interesting trend that is also happening more recently, because, you know, BRI is like huge infrastructure projects, very needed for our country, ports, highways, railways, energy, etc. But there's some agreements lately that China did, for instance, in Latin America, are very, very interesting, because, you know, for the future, what we need is also catching up in technology. This is one of the things that are more crucial for the Global South countries in the next decades. And we are very behind on that. And China has a lot of technology, the most advanced technology in the world right now in many sectors. So for instance, I'll give just two examples. First of all, last year, they had a deal with Argentina Argentina is building a new nuclear power plant, which is also very important, crucial for the next decades in terms of energy. But guess what? China is not only funding the power plant, as they have done with many other countries, $8 billion with 8 years of grace. So Argentina will start paying 8 years. Not only that, but China will transfer the technology that China had mastered a couple of years ago. It's called Hualong. So, and this would be for Argentina SOE, a state-owned company. Oh. So at the end of the process, Argentina not only will get funded, of course they will pay back, but they will have the technology for doing more plants in the country. So this is one. The second one is very recent, like 3 weeks ago, historical agreement between a Chinese company called CATL, who is the largest company in production of lithium batteries in the world. They have like 37% of the global market. And they are going to invest $1 billion to produce lithium batteries in Bolivia. Why this is so important? I mean, President Luis Arce from Bolivia said this is a historic agreement because this is the beginning of the history of the industrialization of the lithium in Bolivia. Look, Bolivia has 24% of the lithium reserves in the planet. It's the biggest reserve in the planet. But guess what? Because of the 500 years of exploitation, Bolivia doesn't have enough resources to invest and doesn't have enough technology still to produce the lithium batteries in Bolivia and to export to the whole world. This is what China is proposing to Bolivia, and this is what they are going to do. So in 3 years, 2 years from now, Bolivia will be able to produce 80 times more what they, in terms of lithium carbonate, which is the process to industrialize, that thing they produce now. So this will be a revolution in the economics of Bolivia. So this is the kind of agreement that China is proposing. And I would say President Lula is coming to Beijing in 1 month, and we definitely hope that he is reading the news, and we know that he is, to see that this is the kind of proposed that China is open to this kind of agreement. And Brazil needs that. Brazil needs a higher level partnerships with China. And lastly, I would say very briefly, one of the major challenges all of our countries have right now is to escape of the domination of the US dollar, because dollar is actually a huge weapon from US, as we know. We know that now we have a problem, nuclear threats again, but one of the most important weapons of mass destruction in the world is a US dollar. They can just destroy entire economies of a country just pushing a button and blocking access of dollar for this country. So we need alternatives. And guess what? Who is the main driver of creation of alternatives right now is China. I mean, 3 days ago, Iraq announced that in China that Iraq is the third largest exporter of oil to China, and Iraqi will export oil to China, and China will pay in yuan, so no dollars. 3 weeks ago, Brazil and China announced also an agreement to facilitate investments and trade between Brazil and China using yuan, bypassing the dollar. So this is what China is doing. In more than almost 30 countries already, China has this kind of agreements. So this will create a new environment in the next years. Of course, the U.S. hegemony in the dollar will last longer, but China is also helping the global South countries with huge financial power that China has, and the fact that China is the most important trade partner of almost 140 countries right now in the world. So China is also creating this opportunity. So this, plus Brics, plus Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you see that there is a wave being created in the global South that will probably make US and European powers even more angry in the next year. So we have to be careful, but we have no choice. We have suffered for 500 years. We have no other choice. We need to react. We need to build alternatives, and Latin America and Africa countries I believe, can count on China to create these alternatives.
You know what? I was reading through the lab chat. There's some comments are really funny. I think this user's name is Bing Sing Chua. I'm not sure that's how to pronounce their name. But this user said, US comes as a big brother. China comes as a partner. That's why they're more welcomed. Interesting. And then this person named CK, he said, build back better world. And then the Ohio train incident happens. You sure you want the US to build your railway tracks? This is not a put down, but I think this comment is really hilarious. I'm sorry, this is not a put down. But yeah, you have to prove that you have the ability to build infrastructure first within your own country. Then other countries will consider, okay, maybe I can have you in my country to build the infrastructure. Yeah. So interesting. Our viewers are very hilarious.
That's the problem. That's exactly the problem, because US cannot solve its own problems of its own people. I mean, you have the news this week that I think 100,000 people died in US last year because of overdoses of drugs, especially the opioids. Kind of like, it's almost like 2 mass shootings a day, an average in US right now. And plus, not even the trains work. They break all the time. So how US can be example for the world if its society is falling apart? So I mean, that's a reality.
So yeah, that's the thing. And I think I saw comments on social networks. They share different railways across the United States just to compare, and they say this infrastructure is like the fourth world. It's not even third world, it's like fourth world. Of course, well, this may sound like a joke, but it's actually made the average American people life suffer. So I mean, the system is not helping American people. They are only the few elites are benefiting from this, but average working class, average American people in America actually suffering from this. Like their income is not growing. They don't have the basic infrastructure. So I think we do need to consider a different alternative way of developing what's really working. So I should not badmouth the United States it's not what I wanted to do, but I think it's time for us to rethink what's really working, how to really benefit everyone. Just like I mentioned in other interviews, that actually the Belt and Road Initiative also welcomes the United States to join, because that's important for all of us, for the globe. So that's how we can build a land bridge connecting every continent. And then we have trade, economic, cultural exchanges from every continent. That's important for the women cooperation. Women cooperation is not just for Chinese, for Africans, for Latin Americans, also for the Europeans, for Latin America, for the Americans, for everybody. But I think it's the first thing we need to get rid of the Cold War mentality. Is either you win, I lose, or I win, you lose. It's like there's another way of developing, the peaceful development. That's what we really need now. So thank you so much, Jen. Yeah, Opoku, you want to say something?
No, I was just agreeing with you that there is another way, and it's a way for the whole world. We need to move beyond this hegemonistic mindset that the US and the West has. Things can be better for all of us if we make the changes needed.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. We have been live streaming for more than 1 hour, longer than expected. So always a pleasure, always so happy to have you on to bring the perspective from the Global South, because it's rarely being mentioned by the Western mainstream media. They don't really care about the voices from the Global South. So that's what I want to do with my program, to bring different perspective on the show, let more people hear what we want, what do we think, what's our worldview are. So thank you so much. And I'm sure I will have you back on this show more often in the next few years. And Marco is already Beijing, and Opoku, I hope to see you once again in Beijing, and we can chat on more topics.
Okay.
So thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. See you soon.
Yeah. Take care.
And guys, thank you for staying with me in this live stream. And you know what? Because the most important political meeting for China is taking place in March, the two sessions, which will set the directions for the country for the whole year. And I will be covering this event again this year. So if you want to know what's going to happen during the two sessions, how China's governance, China's policy will be like this year, you can follow my work either through CGTN or my social networks. You will find my latest coverage on two sessions. So do stay tuned, follow my work, and bye for now. See you soon.
Bye. Take care.